Imagine a confirmation hearing that flips into a trial. A combat veteran sits calmly, folders unopened, while a powerful senator reaches for familiar talking points. One question freezes the room. Where is the evidence? Timelines tighten, screens light up, and silence becomes testimony. What follows isn't shouting. It's receipts, pauses, and a moral verdict no one expected, from anyone watching live. The room in the Hart Building didn't explode with noise when the gavel fell. It collapsed into something heavier, a silence that felt practiced, institutional, and dangerous. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence had convened dozens of times like this, under the same lights, with the same flags, the same cameras positioned at angles chosen years ago to flatter power. But this morning, the balance inside the room was wrong. You could see it in the way staffers stopped whispering, in the way photographers hesitated before lifting their lenses, in the way one senator, Adam Schiff, kept shuffling papers he didn't actually need to read. At the witness table sat Tulsi Gabbard, posture straight, hands resting lightly on a stack of folders she had not yet opened. No notes spread out, no highlighted talking points, no legal pad filled with defensive answers. The calm wasn't theatrical, it was operational, the kind of stillness that comes from someone trained to wait for the first shot rather than fire it. Veterans in the gallery noticed immediately. So did intelligence professionals, the ones who recognized that this wasn't the body language of someone bracing for questions. It was the body language of someone prepared to ask them. Schiff leaned toward his microphone with the familiarity of a man who had spent years controlling rooms exactly like this. He had chaired hearings, dominated panels, shaped narratives long after the cameras stopped rolling. This was supposed to be routine. A confirmation hearing always followed the same script. Probe loyalty, raise doubts, suggest impropriety without alleging it outright. Let the nominee burn time defending themselves. He began the way he always did, his voice steady, measured, already tuned for later replay on CNN and MSNBC. Concerns, judgment, statements that troubled many in the intelligence community. The language was familiar enough that half the room could have mouthed along with him. He referenced Russia without accusing, associations without naming them, loyalty without defining it. This was the playbook. Implication as interrogation, doubt as evidence. Schiff expected resistance, perhaps a careful rebuttal, maybe a rehearsed appeal to service and experience. What he did not expect was interruption. Before he could pivot to the next clause, Gabbard looked up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply spoke, and the effect was immediate. "Before we talk about my judgment," she said, "we need to talk about yours." The words landed oddly, not as an attack but as a procedural correction, like someone pointing out that a document had been filed under the wrong heading. Schiff blinked once, a brief malfunction in the rhythm he knew so well. The chairman shifted slightly in his seat. Somewhere behind the cameras, a producer realized this wasn't following the rundown. "You've told the American people repeatedly," Gabbard continued, "that you had direct evidence of collusion between Donald Trump and Russia. Not suspicions, not concerns, evidence." She paused, just long enough for the room to lean in. "Where is it?" This was the moment the hearing stopped being a hearing. Not because of the question itself. Washington was full of sharp questions, but because of how it was asked. It wasn't framed for commentary. It wasn't padded with qualifiers. It was binary. Evidence existed, or it didn't. Schiff started to answer the way he always did, with context, with history, with the familiar scaffolding of explanation. She cut him off gently, almost politely. "Yes or no?" she said. Did you say you had direct evidence? A staffer glanced up from their laptop. Camera zoomed a fraction closer. Schiff nodded, once reluctantly. Yes. Gabbard opened the first folder. This is where the rhythm changed. And if you were watching as a viewer, not as a partisan, not as a supporter of either figure, but as someone trying to understand how power actually works, you could feel the shift. She didn't argue first. She documented. Screens flanking the room lit up with dated clips, time-stamped, sourced. Schiff on television in 2017. Schiff again in 2018. Schiff weeks before the conclusion of the investigation. Still using the same phrase. More than circumstantial, direct evidence. Clear proof. She didn't editorialize. She let his words hang in the air, repeated back to him in his own voice. Then she reached for the next document. Thinner, more familiar to anyone who had followed the story closely. The Mueller report. Here is where the analysis matters, and where the drama intersects with mechanics of power. The Mueller investigation was not a cable news segment. It was a 2-year federal inquiry with subpoena power, access to intelligence, and the authority to charge crimes. Its central conclusion was unambiguous. It did not establish that the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government. That sentence mattered not because it exonerated or condemned anyone politically, but because it defined the boundary between suspicion and proof. Gabbard read the conclusion aloud, slowly, carefully, as if she wanted every word to register. Then she looked back at Schiff. "You had access to this," she said, "before it was public. You had access to the underlying testimony, and you still told the public you had direct evidence." Another pause. Wait. This is the point where most hearings dissolve into abstraction. But Gabbard didn't let it. She shifted the focus from outcome to process, from politics to responsibility. As chairman of the House Intelligence Committee at the time, Schiff's authority wasn't rhetorical. It was institutional. When he spoke, audiences were meant to believe he was channeling classified knowledge they could not see. That asymmetry between what officials know and what the public is allowed to know is the foundation of trust in intelligence oversight. Abuse it, and the entire structure tilts. Schiff tried again to widen the frame. Contacts, patterns, behavior that was troubling even if it didn't meet a legal definition. Gabbard waited until he finished, then narrowed it back down. "You didn't say troubling," she said. "You said evidence." She gestured to the screens, still frozen on his past statements. "Those words mean something, especially when they come from you." The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Senators understood what was happening now. This wasn't a partisan ambush. It was a jurisdictional challenge. Who gets to define truth when classified information is involved? Who is accountable when the narrative built on that authority collapses? For the viewer at home, this was the first reveal in a longer arc. Not the most explosive allegation, not the most emotional moment, but the foundation. Gabbard was establishing a pattern. Claim, authority, contradiction. She was forcing a reckoning not with ideology, but with record. She closed the folder without ceremony. No flourish, no smile, just paper meeting paper. "This is just the first question," she said, almost to the room rather than to Schiff. "Because if we can't be honest about what we said and what we knew, none of the rest of this matters." The chairman cleared his throat, signaling a desire to move on, to reclaim the agenda. But something fundamental had already shifted. The witness table no longer looked like a place of defense. It looked like a lectern. Schiff glanced down at his prepared notes, then back up, and for the first time that morning, he hesitated. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he couldn't say it without opening the next door. And as a viewer, this is where you realize the hook has done its work. The question wasn't whether you agreed with Gabbard or Schiff politically. The question was whether the system you were watching could survive a sustained examination of its own receipts. The folders on the table hadn't even begun to open yet. The silence that followed didn't break when the chairman spoke. It broke when Adam Schiff reached for his water and missed the rim of the glass by half an inch. It was a small thing, barely noticeable. But in a room calibrated to read micro-movements, it registered. The first question had done what it was meant to do. It had narrowed the lane. There was no room now for broad narratives or rhetorical smoke. Everything that followed would have to pass through process, paper, and proof. Tulsi Gabbard didn't rush the moment. She waited until Schiff set the glass down, until the staffers resumed typing, until the cameras settled into their new framing, slightly closer, slightly tighter. Then she slid the second folder forward. This one was thicker, the edges worn, as if it had been opened and reopened over years. The label on the tab was plain, no flourish, just a word that, in Washington, carried a very specific kind of fear. FISA. If the first exchange had been about credibility, this one would be about consequences. Gabbard didn't need to explain what a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant was. The room knew. The viewers at home, though, needed context, and she gave it the way a prosecutor would, cleanly, without theatrics, letting the weight of the law do the work. A FISA warrant is not a routine subpoena. It authorizes secret surveillance, approved in a closed court, based on representations the target never sees and can never challenge. The entire system rests on the assumption that the government tells the truth when no one is allowed to look. You reviewed the Carter Page FISA application, she said, not as a question but as a statement of record. Correct? Schiff nodded. Yes. You defended it publicly, she continued. You issued a memo saying it was properly obtained. Another nod, slower this time. Gabbard opened the folder and turned it so the committee could see the first page. The header alone changed the temperature in the room. Inspector General, Department of Justice. This wasn't partisan opposition research. It was the internal audit that no agency likes, and no politician can easily wave away. She read selectively, not because there was too much to read, but because selection itself was part of the demonstration. 17 significant errors or omissions, not typos, not judgment calls. Errors that all ran in the same direction, toward surveillance, toward approval, toward intrusion. 17, she repeated, letting the number sit. All in one application. All material. All undisclosed to the court. Schiff tried to interject. Something about context, about the complexity of counterintelligence investigations. Gabbard lifted a finger, not to silence him, but to hold the sequence in place. Before we talk about complexity, she said, let's talk about what the warrant relied on. She flipped to the next section, and now the name everyone had been expecting appeared on the screen. The Steele dossier. A document that had traveled an improbable path from private opposition research to the backbone of a federal surveillance order. The mechanics mattered here, and she walked them slowly for the viewer. The dossier wasn't just used, it was cited. Not just cited, vouched for. Presented to a secret court as credible intelligence, even after the government's own source had begun to unravel it. January 2017, Gabbard said, reading from a declassified interview summary. The FBI interviews the primary subsource, She paused, eyes scanning the page, then looked up. "Do you know what he said?" Schiff shifted. He knew. "He said the information was hearsay," she continued. "Bar talk, conversations with friends, speculation. His words." The room didn't move. Even senators who had defended the warrant in public understood the implication. Once the source collapses, everything built on it becomes radioactive. "And yet," Gabbard went on, "the warrant was renewed, not once, not twice. 3 more times." She didn't accuse. She enumerated. Dates appeared on the screen. Renewals approved after the FBI had reason to doubt the core allegations. Renewals signed off without alerting the court to the source's disavowal. Renewals defended publicly by the man sitting across from her. "You wrote," she said, lifting a single sheet from the folder, "that the FBI did not omit material information from the court." She placed it next to the Inspector General's findings, the contrast doing more work than any argument could. "The Inspector General says otherwise." Schiff tried to reframe it as disagreement between memos. Gabbard let him finish, then leaned back slightly, changing the dynamic without raising her voice. "This isn't a disagreement," she said. "It's a record." For the viewer, this was the hinge of the episode. Up to now, the story could be dismissed as political spin. He said, she said, narratives colliding. But FISA is procedural. It's binary. Either the court was told or it wasn't. Either omissions were material or they weren't. The Inspector General had answered those questions. Schiff had answered them differently, earlier, on television, and in writing. Gabbard closed that section and opened the next, thinner but sharper. Footnotes. The kind most people skip, assuming they're technical. In this case, they were devastating. "The FBI received information," she read, "that the Steele reporting may have been part of a Russian disinformation campaign." The irony hung in the air so long it almost felt deliberate. An investigation into alleged Russian interference, predicated on information that might itself have been Russian interference. The kind of paradox intelligence professionals warn about in training and pray never to encounter in practice. "You defended this process," Gabbard said quietly, "knowing what you knew, knowing what the Bureau knew, and you told the public it was sound." Schiff's response was procedural again. Oversight requires trust. Agencies make mistakes. Hindsight is perfect. Gabbard didn't argue those points. She sidestepped them. "Trust," she said, "is exactly what this court depends on." She tapped the table once, lightly. "And trust is what collapses when material facts are withheld." She let the sentence hang. No follow-up. No immediate question. Just the silence, thick enough that you could feel it pressing against the walls. Then she moved to the next tab. This one wasn't about courts or warrants. It was about what happened after the information left closed rooms, about how intelligence, once gathered, can be used or misused. Gabbard didn't say the word leak right away. She didn't have to. She began with a timeline. Dates, times, classified briefings in the morning, phone calls in the afternoon, headlines at night. The pattern was visual, almost mathematical. Not proof of a single act, but evidence of repetition. 47 instances, she said, reading the number without emphasis. Briefing, call, story. Schiff objected. Coincidence, speculation, correlation, not causation. Gabbard nodded, as if conceding the abstract point, then slid forward another document. A damage assessment. This was where the air left the room. Because damage assessments aren't political. They're written by career professionals whose job is to count costs, no one else wants to admit. Sources relocated. Collection methods altered. Relationships strained. This, Gabbard said, holding up the page, is what unauthorized disclosure looks like on the inside. She didn't say he had written the leaks. She didn't need to. The pattern spoke for itself, and the consequences were documented by the agencies Schiff claimed to defend. At this point, even sympathetic senators had stopped taking notes. The narrative had narrowed again. From Russia to warrants to leaks. From abstract allegations to institutional harm. Each step built on the last, not emotionally, but structurally. And this, Gabbard said, closing the folder with a soft thud, is why the question of evidence matters. She looked directly at Schiff now, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something closer to disappointment. Because when intelligence is wrong, she said, people die. And when intelligence is weaponized, trust dies with it. She paused, letting the words settle, letting the viewers absorb the implication. This wasn't about one man or one hearing anymore. It was about whether the systems designed to protect the country could survive being bent to serve a narrative. The chairman shifted again, signaling time, procedure, a desire to move forward. Gabbard nodded once, acknowledging the constraint. "I'm not finished," she said calmly. "But I'll pause here." The pause was strategic. The room exhaled, collectively, unsure whether the worst had already happened or was still waiting in the folders that remained unopened. For the viewer, the hook tightened. If this was only the second act, if this was just the groundwork, then whatever came next wouldn't be about mistakes. It would be about intent. And intent, in Washington, is where careers end. The third folder was slimmer than the others, but it carried a different kind of weight. It didn't smell like paper and ink. It smelled like oxygen leaving a room. Tulsi Gabbard didn't announce what was inside. She didn't need to. By now, the committee understood the pattern. Each folder narrowed the story, moving from claims to mechanisms, from mechanisms to consequences. This one was about what happens when intelligence doesn't just fail, but is used. She slid a single page forward, the kind that looks unremarkable until you read the margins. Call logs, dates, durations, not content, metadata. The quiet infrastructure of communication that rarely lies even when people do. "Let's talk about timing," she said, her voice measured, almost instructional. Not motive, not ideology, timing. On the screen behind her, a simple timeline appeared. Morning classified briefing, afternoon phone call, evening headline. The sequence repeated, again and again, across months. She didn't accuse Adam Schiff of leaking a specific sentence or document. Instead, she did something more dangerous. She showed repetition, patterns, probability shrinking toward inevitability. "Correlation doesn't prove causation," Schiff said quickly, seizing the familiar refuge of logic. Gabbard nodded. "That's true," she replied. "Once, maybe twice, not 47 times." The number hung there, unadorned. 47 instances in which classified briefings were followed by direct outreach to media outlets and then by stories containing information that had not existed in public space before. Sources described vaguely, officials familiar, people briefed. But the pool of people who could have been familiar was small, and the timing was unforgiving. For the viewer, this was the pivot from abstract wrongdoing to operational damage. Intelligence systems are built on compartmentalization, on the idea that information moves deliberately, not impulsively. When that system leaks, the consequences don't show up as headlines. They show up as silence from sources who stop answering calls, as allies who hesitate before sharing what they know. Gabbard opened the next page without ceremony. A damage assessment, stripped of flourish, written in the clinical language of people who don't get invited on television. Sources relocated, she read. Collection methods altered. Liaison relationships strained. She didn't look up right away. She let the words do what they were designed to do, describe cost without emotion. Then she raised her eyes to the committee. "This," she said, "is the part you don't see on cable news." Schiff shook his head slightly, disputing the implication without directly addressing it. Gabbard didn't press. She wasn't finished. She closed that section and turned the tab again, moving the story forward chronologically, the way prosecutors do when they want you to feel inevitability. October 2020. 3 weeks before a presidential election. The country already frayed, already suspicious, already primed to doubt anything that didn't fit its preferred narrative. A story appears in the New York Post, based on emails and files from a laptop allegedly belonging to Hunter Biden. The substance of the story mattered less at first than the reaction to it. "Within hours," Gabbard said, "the story is throttled." She gestured to the screen as logos appeared, not dramatic, just recognizable. Twitter, Facebook, posts limited, links suppressed, accounts locked. The explanation offered to the public was simple and ominous. Russian disinformation. "And you," she said, turning back to Schiff, "went on television and said exactly that." The clip played. Schiff's voice, confident, declarative, no qualifiers, no uncertainty, clear statements, delivered with the authority of a man who chaired the Intelligence Committee and knew how much weight that carried. "This comes from the Kremlin," his past self said. Gabbard stopped the video mid-frame. "When you said that," she asked, "did you know the FBI already had the laptop?" Schiff hesitated. The hesitation was the answer before the words arrived. He spoke about assessments, about context, about patterns of foreign interference. Gabbard waited, then tightened the lane again. "The FBI took possession of the laptop in December 2019, she said. "They verified its authenticity. They spent months examining it. By October 2020, it was not an unknown quantity." She didn't accuse him of having read the file. She asked something more fundamental. "You oversaw the agencies responsible for this," she said. "Either you knew or you didn't. If you knew, you misled the public. If you didn't, you weren't doing your job." The room went still in a different way now. This wasn't about past statements. It was about active suppression of information at a moment when voters were deciding. Gabbard leaned back slightly, giving the viewer space to connect the dots. "And then," she continued, "there was the letter." She didn't need to name it. Everyone remembered it. 51 former intelligence officials, their titles lending gravity to a document that carefully hedged its language while achieving its purpose. The letter didn't claim proof, it claimed suspicion. It didn't say the laptop was fake. It said it had the hallmarks of something dangerous. And yet, Gabbard said, the headlines didn't say hallmarks, they said Russian disinformation. She lifted another page, interviews conducted long after the election, when the urgency had faded and candor came easier. Former officials admitting they hadn't seen the laptop, hadn't reviewed the emails, had signed based on trust, not evidence. "You amplified that letter," she said. "You went further than it did. You turned suspicion into certainty." Schiff objected again, arguing that warning the public was responsible. Gabbard nodded once. "Warnings require evidence," she said. "Otherwise, they're just narratives with consequences." For the viewer, This was where the story crossed a line from misuse of power to interference with choice. Platforms acted. Media followed. A story was buried not because it was proven false, but because authoritative voices suggested it might be dangerous. The distinction mattered, and Gabbard made sure it stayed visible. She turned the page again. "Let's talk about subpoenas," she said. The word landed differently now, not as an abstract legal tool, but as a weapon. She read names into the record, each one a reminder of how far investigative authority can reach when unrestrained. Devin Nunes, a sitting member of Congress. John Solomon, a reporter. Rudy Giuliani's attorney. Phone records, Gabbard said, published without notice. Schiff defended the legality of the process, the committee vote, the necessity. Gabbard didn't dispute the technicalities. She went somewhere else. "Power doesn't have to be illegal to be abusive," she said. "It just has to be used without restraint." She described the chilling effect not in slogans, but in consequences. Journalists reconsidering sources. Lawmakers watching their own communications. Attorneys wondering whether privilege still meant anything when politics entered the room. "And when the House censured you," she added quietly, "they weren't arguing law, they were arguing judgment." The mention of censure shifted the energy again. It wasn't an allegation. It was a recorded act, a rare one, joined by members of Schiff's own party. Gabbard didn't linger on it. She didn't need to. It stood as a marker, a signpost that something had already broken. She closed the folder, finally, and rested her hands on the table. "This," she said, "is the through line." The room waited. When intelligence authority is used to shape narratives, suppress information, and intimidate critics, she continued, it stops being oversight and starts being control. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The cumulative effect of the timelines, the documents, the pauses had done what argument alone never could. For the viewer, the picture was now uncomfortably clear. This wasn't about one leak or one statement. It was about a system bending in the same direction again and again toward political ends. Gabbard glanced at the remaining folders, still unopened. The heaviest ones. "I'm going to stop here," she said, "because what comes next isn't about process. It's about intent." The chairman shifted, relieved and uneasy at the same time. Schiff stared at the table, the weight of his own record pressing down in ways no cross-examination ever had. For the audience watching at home, the hook tightened one last notch. If the first act had challenged credibility, and the second had exposed procedural failure, this third act had crossed into something more dangerous, the deliberate shaping of reality itself. And there were still folders left. The final folder was the thickest, not because it contained more paper, but because it carried the weight of culmination. Tulsi Gabbard didn't open it right away. She stood instead, straightening only slightly, enough to signal that what came next was not another question, but a closing argument. The room felt it. Chairs stopped creaking. Pens stopped moving. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to pull back or lean in. "This is where intent matters," she said, her voice steady, almost subdued. "Because when power repeats itself, pattern becomes choice." She opened the folder and turned to the section that had lived for years in the bloodstream of American politics. Impeachment. 2 of them. 2 moments presented to the public as constitutional necessity, framed as last resorts, defended as solemn obligations. Gabbard didn't challenge the right to impeach. She challenged the way it had been done. She projected the transcript of the Ukraine call first, not the commentary, not the summaries, but the words themselves. She read them aloud, with the care of someone reading into a record that cannot be corrected later. No threats, no demands, no explicit quid pro quo. The words sat plainly on the screen, unadorned, inconvenient. Then she switched to the next slide. A clip of Adam Schiff speaking during the opening of the impeachment inquiry. His voice theatrical, urgent, reading a dramatized version of the call. Lines added. Tone intensified. Meaning transformed. The room watched the juxtaposition, the actual words beside the performed ones. "You said this was the essence of the call," Gabbard said. "Essence means accuracy. It means fidelity." She paused. "You didn't paraphrase. You invented." Schiff began to protest, reaching for the word he had used years earlier. Parody, illustration, context. Gabbard waited until he finished, then tilted her head slightly. "Parody is labeled," she said. "Evidence is not." She let the silence stretch, long enough for the viewer to understand the distinction. This wasn't about style. It was about substitution, replacing primary evidence with a narrative that served a purpose. The Senate had watched that narrative. The country had absorbed it. And when the actual transcript emerged, the damage was already done. She moved to the second impeachment without transition. January 6th. Another moment burned into collective memory, replayed until it hardened into myth. She didn't defend the riot. She didn't minimize it. She did something more surgical. She played the clip of the speech. Not the shouted lines that had dominated coverage, but the quieter ones, peacefully and patriotically. The phrase echoed in the chamber, oddly fragile after years of omission. "You didn't show this," she said. "You edited it out." Schiff responded with the argument of atmosphere, of cumulative rhetoric, of months of pressure. Gabbard didn't deny that words matter. She narrowed the question again. "When you present evidence," she said, "you present all of it, especially the parts that complicate your case." The viewer at home didn't need legal training to understand what was happening. Evidence had been curated. Context had been shaped. Exculpatory material had been minimized or removed, not accidentally, but systematically. The impeachments had failed not because of partisan loyalty alone, but because the record, when fully exposed, didn't support the narrative that had been built around it. Gabbard closed the impeachment section and turned to the last set of documents. Subpoenas, phone records, names that didn't belong in intelligence files, but had ended up there anyway. She read them into the record slowly, one by one, as if acknowledging each person individually. A colleague in Congress, a journalist, an attorney. Communications collected, published, normalized under the banner of Oversight. "This," she said, "is where the Constitution bends." She explained it the way a prosecutor would for a jury unfamiliar with doctrine. Oversight exists to check executive power, not to surveil political rivals. The First Amendment exists to protect the press, not to intimidate it through exposure. Attorney-client privilege exists to preserve the right to counsel, not to be pierced for convenience. "You used lawful tools," she said, "for unlawful ends." She corrected herself. "Unconstitutional ends." Schiff argued authority again, votes, precedent. Gabbard let him finish, then returned to the record. "When the House censured you," she said, "they weren't voting on law. They were voting on conduct." The word censured carried a particular chill, rare, formal, a mark meant to endure. She didn't list the vote count. She didn't need to. The existence of the censure spoke louder than the margin. She stepped back from the table then, allowing the folders to remain where they were, stacked neatly, no longer threatening because they had already done their work. "For 4 hours," she said, "we've walked through claims, warrants, leaks, suppression, subpoenas, and impeachments." She didn't look at Schiff as she spoke now. She looked at the committee, at the institution. "In every case," she continued, "the same pattern appears. Authority invoked, evidence withheld or reshaped, consequences externalized." She turned back to Schiff at last. "You questioned my judgment," she said. "You questioned my loyalty. You questioned whether I could be trusted with intelligence." Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "So I'll ask you something simpler than anything I've asked today." She paused, long enough that the room seemed to lean forward as one. "Have you ever told the truth?" The silence that followed wasn't procedural. It wasn't the silence of decorum or respect. It was the silence of a system confronted with itself. Schiff opened his mouth, closed it, glanced down, then up again. Words came, but they weren't answers. They were abstractions. Service, intention, belief. Gabbard cut through them gently. "Truth doesn't need interpretation," she said. "It just needs to be spoken." She turned then, not to Schiff, but to the rest of the committee. "My question isn't just for him," she said. "It's for you." She let that land before continuing. "If someone censured for abusing intelligence authority can sit on this committee," she asked, "what does that say about this committee?" She paused. "If someone stripped of access for leaking and misrepresentation can still judge the trustworthiness of others, what does that say about the standards we enforce?" No one answered. There was no answer that fit inside the room. Gabbard gathered the folders at last, stacking them with the same precision she had maintained throughout the hearing. She didn't slam them shut. She didn't gesture with them. She simply held them, evidence no longer in motion. "I've answered your questions," she said to the chairman. "I've asked mine." She stepped away from the table, not quickly, not dramatically. The cameras followed her instinctively, the way they follow momentum. As she reached the door, she stopped, turned back once, not to speak, but to look. The look wasn't accusatory. It was final. Then she left. The room didn't erupt. It didn't applaud, at least not immediately. It sat in the aftermath, the kind that lingers when something irreversible has occurred. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence would continue. Votes would be taken. Statements would be issued. Spin would follow. But for the viewer watching, the arc was complete. This wasn't about party. It wasn't about ideology. It was about whether power could be forced to account for itself when confronted with its own receipts. A combat veteran had walked into a hearing designed to test her, and had instead tested the institution that summoned her. She didn't do it with slogans. She did it with process, with documents, with pauses, with questions that narrowed until there was nowhere left to hide. And that, more than any vote that would follow, was the verdict.